Acceso, ok, grazie. Benvenuti al nostro secondo incontro della prima sessione di Politicall. Grazie per la vostra presenza. Questa mattina abbiamo ascoltato con grande interesse la lezione del professor Mercorio, grazie, che professore di computer science, che ci ha fatto capire con l'intelligenza artificiale e con il digitale come sta cambiando il mondo. Ci ha fatto vedere una volta di più e sotto un lato ancora rispetto a quelli che avevamo visto negli anni, la complessità del mondo dell'informazione in particolare, che è quello che si sta sviluppando fortissimamente nel nostro tempo, e gli aspetti di difficoltà di controllo, difficoltà di dominio che nessuno ha completamente di questa informazione che ci circonda. E oggi pomeriggio, nell'ottica appunto della scuola di politica che siamo, cerchiamo di rivolgerci invece al lato istituzionale, cioè preso atto dell'immensità del potere che sta dietro a questa gestione dell'informazione, che abbiamo visto essere per lo più in mano a soggetti privati, oggetto di enormi investimenti di risorse, eccetera, come si comportano gli attori istituzionali, cioè quei soggetti a cui la società demanda esattamente la gestione del potere. Quindi abbiamo chiesto, per fare questo, abbiamo chiesto aiuto a Dimitar Lilkov, Senior Research Officer, cioè ricercatore del Wilfried Martens Center, che è il think tank del Partito Popolare Europeo, con cui collaboriamo strettissimamente già da qualche anno per l'organizzazione di questa scuola di politica, di aiutarci appunto a entrare nella prospettiva delle istituzioni europee in particolare, che si stanno occupando direttamente di questa materia. Le sue ricerche, le ricerche di Dimitar, si svolgono nell'ambito del digitale, quindi saprà sicuramente darci una prospettiva su questo specifico ambito. E il titolo della sua relazione è esattamente una provocazione su questo, cioè sovranità tecnologica, legislazione europea e realtà nell'età digitale. Lascio direttamente a lui la parola. Come stamattina, preparatevi bene le domande, perché ci sarà poi lo spazio per il dibattito. Grazie Dimitar.
Grazie. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. My name is Dimitar. Pleasure to be here. Warm word of thanks to the organizers of Politicall, to the Grossman Center, and all the other partners involved. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope that with the Martens Center we'll have the pleasure to collaborate in the future. It's a bit difficult after Professor Fabio to continue. He had a very engaging presentation, so I'll try to keep the rhythm. Also, word of thanks to our fantastic translator, interpreter. I'll try to keep it, balanced, so I don't talk too much so the interpretation can follow. Technological sovereignty. This was one of the biggest keywords, one of the favorite political stamps in the last couple of years in the EU. If you ask many European politicians what do they actually mean by technological sovereignty, you'll get different explanations. So today I want to talk to you about the ambitions, the legislation, the aspirations coming in the last couple of years from Brussels, but also about the realities. Because as we know, ambition is one thing, reality is something else. I'll start in a very different way. Have you watched the movie or read the book? Can I see a show of hands? You've seen the movie? And the book? The book? Okay, a couple. I became a bit obsessed with Dune in the last couple of years, watched the movie, and then I started reading the books. And as you know, it talks about the society in the future, different planets, different galaxy, and so forth. But there's something very interesting in the Dune universe, which is not in the movies. It's only in the books. It's about what happened before the big fights started. And according to the universe of Dune, in the beginning, there was this great revolt, the big uprising against technology. In the beginning, there was prosperity. You had amazing technology in the world of Dune. People were living very wealthy lives. You had like robots, cyborgs, artificial intelligence. Everybody was living in this, fantastic prosperity. But at a certain point, the machines became too intelligent. And at a certain point, there was a mix between human intelligence and computer intelligence, and humanity became colonized by these advanced thinking machines. And in the Dune book, there's the talk about the great uprising in which humanity decides that it wants to stand up against the machines. So it breaks the machines, it regains control, and then humanity in the end says and decides, we're going to use technology to a certain extent, but we will never allow that a machine has the likeness of the human mind. And this becomes, in the Dune universe, becomes even a religious principle. Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of the human mind. With the colleagues yesterday, we had dinner, and they reminded me about Pope Francis's speech on artificial intelligence. It was mentioned in the first session, and I think Pope Francis makes a similar kind of message, no? Be careful about mixing technology and the human mind. Think about this and keep it on the back of your head, and I'll return to this analogy in the end of the presentation. So now let's go to the EU. What was the European tech ambition? We can say it started around 10 years ago, 2014, 2015. In Brussels, in many other European countries, there was the feeling that something is changing, that technology is advancing, data becomes the new oil, this famous statement, data is the new oil. And European partners started making different proposals for different types of regulation, with the idea to develop the golden standard for regulation in the online age. The thinking was that if Europe comes up with the best rules, this will also be a golden standard for the rest of the world. And I think it's a very noble and a very good idea, because in the online space, there's no rules, right? It's a wild west. You all remember what happened in 2016, for example, with Brexit, with Cambridge Analytica, when the whole globe realized that having open internet is great, but it also brings problems and challenges. Europe decided to pursue technological sovereignty, meaning we will be independent. Let's not be dependent on the Chinese and the Americans for our technology. Let's make sure that when we make our decisions, our people, our Europeans, are protected. Not only personal data, but also economically. They have open access to an ecosphere which is not filled with monopolies. Our European companies can have access and make money of digital infrastructure and digital services. So let's be sovereign. We also wanted to be the innovation leader, or at least that's the ambition always, right? Let's be the number one. Let's also make sure that the social market economy we have in Europe, meaning it's an economic market-based society, but it's also a social market economy which cares about human rights, fundamental values, fundamental protection, welfare. Let's try to bring those principles online. And finally, there's this famous academic Brussels effect. It comes from a Finnish author, The book is called The Brussels Effect. And basically the author makes the case that because Europe has such a big market, we are 450 million people, 450 million users. If Europe makes the laws for the digital age, the rest of the world needs to comply with these rules, maybe also adopt those rules if they want to do business with us. Because our market potential is so high, we can influence other players for the better. We can influence them so they can also pursue this golden standard of technology. And I'll just give a couple of examples, because I'm talking about regulation, but what do I actually mean? First, it started with GDPR, 2016. I'm sure that many of you have followed this saga, or maybe at least heard about the GDPR. Very quickly, the GDPR wanted to preserve our privacy online. Your personal data online is your own and cannot be exploited by big tech companies or other governments. You cannot be surveilled online. Children have protections online, so on and so forth. It was the big breakthrough in 2016 when Brussels told the world, we're going to make some new rules and you better comply. In 2019-2020, we also had a couple of other new acts, and I'll tell you what happened after to these. The Digital Markets Act, the idea from Brussels was the following. We have monopolies online, let's be honest. We have big companies, mostly American, there's also Chinese, which are dominating the online space. And if you're a small company, if you're a small European company, it's very difficult to penetrate those markets because Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and the rest have a monopoly on the whole chain. And the Digital Markets Act, the DMA, tried to create these rules so that these big companies have reduced or follow certain rules, and our European companies can be more competitive. Digital Services Act, DSA, it entered into force this year, and the idea was that if we want to keep our society safe from disinformation, Russian interference, we need rules for content moderation. Because we saw what happened 8 to 10 years ago during elections time, Cambridge Analytica and so forth, the Digital Services Act, the idea was that Brussels finds new ways to regulate content and we make sure that there isn't Russian propaganda in our networks. The Artificial Intelligence Act, I'll speak about this specifically in like 10 minutes or so. And also we have the EU Cyber Resilience Act. The idea of the EU Cyber Resilience Act was that every device we have, laptop, phone, tablet, it needs to have a certain cybersecurity requirement so that we know that this device is not surveilled by, let's say, the Chinese. And there's at least a minimum standard, a minimum technical standard, which gives me, as a user, the confidence that this not only works, but it's also safe. What are the problems with these ambitions? And again, I support the ambition, but in the last 5 to 10 years, slowly but surely, we come to realize that there's problems with this ambition. Number one is implementation, enforcement of these rules. I'll give you a good example. The GDPR. Sounds very nice, protecting your personal data, protecting children's rights online, your religious views, your political views. Nobody should know about them or exploit this type of data. But the GDPR was devised in the following way. It's a European law, but every member state, every country in the EU has its own bureaucracy for dealing with the GDPR. And all of the American big tech companies register their headquarters and their main field of operation in the country of Ireland. Why Ireland? Ireland is very pro-American. It has very positive tax incentives. It's open for business. That's okay. But the funny thing about Ireland is that their national bureaucracy for the GDPR and their specific national administrator for data protection didn't do its job right. And even though you had the European rules on the European level, Ireland was supposed to enforce them. But you have this small administrative unit, let's say with 10, 20 people dealing with data protection. And because all the American companies are registered in Ireland, all the cases needs to go through the Irish administration. And imagine like a small administrative unit handling cases for millions, if not billions of euros. Very technically specific, very burdensome. And all the American companies have amazing legal teams, you know? Americans are great at that. So what actually happened was that we could not enforce the rules, even though the rules are fine. Ireland and its specific bureaucracy, I don't want to be so aggressive to the country of Ireland, but this is what actually happened. You have the ambition of regulating the online space, but in practice, a national capital cannot do its job. There's also lots of loopholes. There's a lot of loopholes. And big multinational companies, not only American, but also Chinese, and from the rest of the world as well, they invest a lot of money to find those loopholes in the European legislation and circumvent it. The other big problem we had in Europe, of course, is that even though we had the rules and the ambition, we don't have the same access to money. We're simply not this completed economic unit yet, for better or worse. It's more difficult to find venture capital in Europe. We have less digital unicorns, billion-dollar valuation companies as in America, for example. And European SMEs, European small and medium enterprises, are disadvantaged because we have national markets. We have national languages. I meet lots of companies in Brussels and many representatives from amazing businesses. And I ask them, what's the biggest problem? How can you make money? How can you scale your startup? And they tell me, how can you scale a startup when you have 24 languages in the EU, different languages? So what most of these European startups do, even if they're really good, for example, Spotify is a great example. First, they go to America, they scale, they get the money, and then they come back to Europe so they can distribute their services and expand their markets. We have the fundamental problem that we still don't have a capital markets union. The EU is not this unified investment space. You have national lobbies, national borders, you have still administrative protection and bureaucracies which prevent European companies to actually scale and actually grow. The big argument as well, which sometimes is over-exaggerated. Many Americans like to say, oh, Europeans, you only do laws and you don't do anything practical. But it is true that we're putting in place more and more legislation and regulation, which has the ambition, it's a positive aim, but in the end of the day, if you're a small company, you cannot follow all of these rules. You simply don't have the manpower, the money, the time, the expertise to follow all of the regulations coming from Brussels. And last point with the problems we have, our data is still not safe. Our data is still exploited by American companies, Chinese companies, surveillance for AI models, and so forth. These are the main problems we've had in the EU, and they continue. And until we solve at least a couple of these problems, we're not going to be this amazing next generation EU which creates the big breakthroughs. So we tried to solve some of the most pressing problems. But if you write the rules, that doesn't mean that you're going to be number one. You need to have a market share. You need to have the investment. You need to have the capacity. And we're failing in creating an actual digital market, failing in getting the money, the innovation, and so forth. So the question is, where are we going? Kovadis. Where is this whole thing headed? I'm opening another topic which was mentioned, but I think it's very important on the side. Look what happened in the last 5 years with energy prices in the EU. This was in the Draghi report. Mario Draghi likes to talk about energy as well, and he was absolutely on the money. He was absolutely right. 5 years ago, we had comparable power for industry, price for industrial power in China, the US, in Europe. But in 22, after the war, look what happens. In industrial gas prices, it's even worse. European businesses and companies and families are paying double, if not triple, the energy price compared to China and the US. And this slide and this graph means, and if this continues, and unfortunately this will continue unless we fix it, this means that we're going to have a structural problem. Not only about industry, but also about digital. The professor in the previous panel mentioned this, of course. You need electricity. You need data centers. You need cooling of the servers. All of this requires huge amounts of energy. I think he gave the comparison with Argentina and Japan. That's absolutely true. How are we going to remain competitive? And how can we create the next generation stuff if this remains like this, if we're paying so much price for energy? So it's more expensive to create stuff and to manufacture stuff in Europe. It's very costly to keep data centers. That's why most of the data centers are outside of Europe. There's huge data centers, by the way, in Iceland, in the middle of nowhere, in Iceland. You know why? Because Iceland has geothermal energy. It takes from Earth's core, and they transform it for data centers. We don't have this energy in Europe. The Americans have turned very protectionist in the last couple of years. There's this IRA, US Inflation Reduction Act, which promises $400 billion to companies from everywhere, in America, but also international companies, if they create new clean technologies in America. An absolute protectionist shift with very easy regulations. Basically, if you are doing recycling of lithium, for example, or if you are creating hydrogen, come to the US, and we're going to give you cheap energy, we're going to give you subsidies, and we're going to give you tax breaks. And I meet many people in Brussels, from startups and industrial players, and they tell me, Americans are calling me. And they're basically, people who are representatives of the government, they're saying, move your business to the US. We're going to give you all of these amazing opportunities if you create clean energy in the US. What's our response? Because in Europe, we are spending also a lot of money on green stuff, right? But we're spending it in a very slow, very bureaucratic way. You need to wait for years before a grant application is approved, while the Americans are just pumping the money. On the other side of the world, the Chinese, what's their approach? Subsidizing their companies like crazy. Since the early 2010s, in the last 15 years, they've been strategically subsidizing key industries, losing money, pumping money, because they know they want to monopolize these industries. And they have. Solar production, battery production, chip production. Lots of this is happening in China. Also why? There's no data protection in China. The sensitive data, the personal data is being used to train the algorithms. And also they're pumping lots of energy from coal, really dirty coal. 60% of Chinese energy usage comes from coal. In Europe, right now it's 8%. In China, it's more than 60%. Even though you read all the news about China producing the electric vehicles and the clean technologies, that's true. But they're pumping coal like crazy, which gives them cheap energy. While we're trying to be very sustainable and very clean in our economy and not have enough energy. So we're not going to dominate next generation technology in the EU if this remains like this. That's the simple negative conclusion, unfortunately. Another terrifying example. Look what happened to Germany. The blue line is industrial production. And the red line is energy-intensive production, meaning the industries which require a lot of energy. Glass manufacturing, steel manufacturing, fertilizer. The industrial production fell very sharply in 2020 because of COVID. This happened everywhere. But look what happened in 23. Look at the red line. In 23, it's even worse than during COVID. In Germany, because they are so obsessed about the Green Deal and about coal and dirty energy and so forth, and because they closed their nuclear reactors, their production went down. And the big push, let's reduce emissions, resulted in reduced production. I hope I don't see these numbers in Italy, but I know that also Italy was impacted by the energy crisis, and I know that Italian manufacturing also went down. And this is very worrying. It's very easy to make jokes about the Germans. I like to make jokes about the Germans. But if the Germans keep up this bad production, if this recession continues in Germany, this means a recession for the whole European Union. Final slide, and then I'll continue about technology. For the first time in the last 3 decades, we had a trade deficit in the EU. This is our trade balance. This is data from Euractiv. You can see 2012, 2013, 2014. The economy was improving. We had trade balance was positive. And then 22, what happens? Energy crisis. We had 400 billion euros of a trade balance because of the energy crisis. So these problems are structural, and it has a direct link with our digital performance. Until we solve this problem, we're never going to lead the world in digital. Okay. Let's talk about the AI Act. The EU basically said, artificial intelligence is coming, and this can bring huge risks. Fine, that's true. So the approach was the following. We don't regulate the technology specifically, but we regulate the risk. Depending of what kind of AI you're producing, determines what kind of regulation we're going to impose on you. This is in the AI Act. The full AI Act started, parts of it are in force from this year, but the full AI Act is going to be in force in 25. And the whole legislation is built around this pyramid of risk. If you are producing a service or an AI technology which has unacceptable risks, this is not going to be approved in the EU. First example is technology which goes against fundamental human rights. Second example is technologies which are doing real-time live surveillance for facial recognition in public places. This is also prohibited, and I support this, absolutely. Number 3, social scoring. The professor mentioned this in the previous panel. The EU basically says, if you're creating an AI technology which puts a number next to a person, if we start ranking digitally people for their economic performance or for their educational achievements or their professional achievements, this goes against European values. This is what happens in China, by the way. There's a social credit score. He also mentioned it, by the way, in the morning session. Based on your daily life, your online usage, your behavior in society, you get a rating. And if this rating becomes really negative, you're discriminated. You don't get some kind of services, maybe you pay some fines. So the EU is saying, this is unacceptable. We cannot use algorithmic management for social purposes. There was a great case in Holland, in Netherlands, a couple of years ago. The Dutch social ministry decided to make an algorithm which decides on social payments. If you're a migrant or if you're unemployed, you give your documents and you say, I want to get some social benefits, and then they gave the decision to an algorithm. And then the Dutch courts basically says, this is unacceptable. You cannot rank people judged on certain technical criteria. So these are the three main examples where the EU says, if you're creating this type of technology, for us this is unacceptable and this will be banned across the EU. Fine. Then comes high risk. And here it gets really tricky. The AI Act says, if your technology is used in a field which we think is high risk, you need to comply with a lot of regulations. You need to comply with a lot of rules because we want to make sure that your AI algorithm not only works, but it's transparent, it doesn't discriminate, so on and so forth. And in the high-risk system category, the examples are, let's say, in critical infrastructure, educational purposes, law enforcement, employment. If you want to create AI in these fields, you need to comply with a very long list of regulations and expectations if you want to use your algorithms in the EU. In the limited risk category, it's deep fakes, there's a typo. The example of limited risk category is deep fakes and chatbots. Basically, the EU says if you're talking with a chatbot online, you need to receive like a notification which says, this is a chatbot, it's not a real person. You need to be informed that you're talking with a machine. And the final category is minimal risk, where basically if you fall in the minimal risk category, it means that you have very little requirements and you can operate your AI business across the EU. So the whole AI Act philosophy is based around this pyramid. The problem is, as I mentioned, with the high risk category. Imagine that you are a school in Torino, and the school decides to make an AI algorithm for educational purposes. You need to comply with so many rules. These are very technical things, I just wanted to show them to you. You need to have a risk assessment, okay. You also need to have high quality data set. You need to have transparency. You need to have detailed documentation of everything you want to do and preserve it for the next 5 years. You need to have human oversight. You need to have all of these things. And what happens is that all of these rules are making many companies, many educational institutions, many family businesses, they simply do not want to do AI because of these rules, because it's so difficult to comply with these rules. Even though we all agree that we don't want to have social scoring and facial recognition, that's fine. But for the AI implications, which are useful, which we can scale our businesses or our economy, you need to follow all of these rules. And in the end, they don't want to invest in that because there's lots of risk that you'll be prosecuted for this and you'll be fined. If you don't comply with the AI Act, you can get a fine up to 10% of your annual turnover. And for many companies, this is a huge risk. So, what are the priorities for the EU? And what we need to do in the next couple of years. I'm laying out these important points because it will be great to discuss with you if this makes sense and what's the dialogue in the debate in Italian society. We do not have not only the capacity to lead innovation in the future. But when we talk about digital sovereignty, we're also not sovereign. Because our data is still used by American companies, Chinese companies. Our infrastructure is still liable to be hit by attacks. And let's be honest, we are using, in our society is using applications and services which most likely are being navigated by other countries. TikTok is a great example. It's funny, it's dance videos and so forth, but right now on TikTok you have so much political propaganda and political censorship because TikTok complies with the rules of the Chinese government. We're doing digital infrastructure in Europe, which is very important. 5G, next generation infrastructure, next generation services. But we also have Huawei and ZTE, who are specifically labeled, this is not my assessment, personal, but it's the assessment of the European Commission, who says these are untrusted vendors. We do not know whether this data, how it's used. Because when a Huawei technical tower for 5G deals with the data, all of the software development and all the software updates happen from Beijing or from other parts of China. And the data keeps flowing. And we simply do not have any idea if we are protected. So we talk about digital sovereignty, technological sovereignty, but we're still exposed, we're still open. The thing I mentioned in the beginning, scaling a true digital market, we still cannot scale. We have brilliant businesses, we have brilliant potential in Europe, but we're a fragmented market and we cannot scale these opportunities. Breakthrough investment, capital markets, I mentioned this. And in the end, maybe a slide about going forward. All of these are question marks, because it will be great to discuss this with you. If you remember in the beginning, I talked about the great revolt against technology. And many American companies are saying, Europeans are technophobic. You don't want to see innovation in Europe. You don't want to see, breakthrough stuff happening. I disagree. Maybe we need a war of independence or an act of independence that we make sure that in the future this also happens in Europe, not only buying and paying rent to other countries. What's the role of regulation? And can we actually bring the golden standard internationally? Again, a question to you. Can we also cooperate internationally so we avoid proliferation of artificial intelligence? Also biotechnologies, cloning, potential biowarfare. How can we make sure that this doesn't happen? Do we actually have the tools to do it internationally? What does this mean for our relationship with the US? Now there's a new president who is causing a lot of problems and a lot of headaches. What's the future of our relationship with the Americans? Because even though we know that they're surveilling our citizens, and even though we know that their companies are monopolies and they're exploiting opportunities and they're not giving enough access to European SMEs. What does technological sovereignty mean for our cooperation with Latin America, with Asia, with the rest of the world? And of course, the huge problem with the China challenge. The fact that they're becoming more and more dominating in so many fields, and we simply do not have right now the answer to them because of the complexity, the trade relationship, the political relationship, and so forth. These are just some of the questions I would like to discuss, and I'll be really, really happy to hear your questions. Thank you for your attention.
Grazie Dimitar, devo dire che ci hai offerto una panoramica molto ricca e da cui sicuramente verranno fuori questioni interessanti. Apriamo subito il dibattito e quindi se ci sono interventi, domande, questioni. Mauro.
Grazie dell'interessante presentazione, anche un po', devo dire, ma sconfortante, anche se sono cose che un po' sapevo, cioè nel senso, a me sembra che quello che emerge dalla tua relazione è un po' una debolezza politica dell'Europa, e quindi se concordi, se puoi dire la direzione verso cui andare. Un aspetto che emergeva da quello che dicevi, anche un po' della situazione in cui siamo, forse è proprio il tema della difesa. In questa fase storica in cui stiamo vivendo potrebbe essere un punto attorno a cui concentrare le forze, perché tutta la legislazione è utile se è a servizio di qualche ideale, di qualche scopo comune, che mi sembra un po' il punto su cui come Europa siamo deboli. E allora volevo sapere la tua opinione a riguardo. Grazie.
Raccogliamo pure qualche altra domanda, se c'è. Davide.
Grazie mille della relazione. Se ci potevi aiutare a capire quali sono le posizioni politiche che i partiti hanno assunto rispetto ai partiti europei hanno assunto rispetto al tema dell'AI Act, e soprattutto quella prettamente del PPE. Ecco.
Se c'è ancora una domanda, la raccogliamo. Prego.
Do you think has been the innovation of technology developing faster than we expected, and does this happen?
To you. Thank you for the great questions. I'll start in order. Yeah, pessimism maybe, but you know, I've been sitting in so many presentations in Brussels on these topics, people from the European Commission, people from the Parliament, and what I get is never-ending optimism. And you get a presentation about the rules and the ambitions, and this sounds very nice. But I don't think this is fair. I don't think this is honest. The Germans are very good at this self-assurance that we have the ambition, we're thinking we're doing something good, but we need to be obvious about the impacts. So that's why I sound very pessimistic, and I am a bit pessimistic, because I've been surrounded by absolute optimism, especially on digital and also on climate, energy, sustainability issues. Brussels was this factory for world peace optimism, and I think we're in a completely different situation. Just a prelude. About the direction. I was even more depressed during the war, 2022, 2023. But since then, I see a slow realization of what's really happening. That's why citizens are very important. That's why communities like this are very important, because people in Brussels start receiving a wake-up call from people who are active, people who vote, people who care, people who work, and people who generate prosperity. And our economic fundament is troubled. And I think now, especially now after these elections, there is a change of course. We're still talking about the Green Deal and about climate, fine, but this is not the biggest priority. The biggest priority right now is competitiveness, prosperity, and economic security. Because for a couple of years, we were living in this dream world. Money is never ending, helicopter money, low inflation rates. right? But in the last couple of years, we saw what happened. Inflation, high interest rates, stagnation. So now the political priority in Brussels is competitiveness, which means reducing certain legislation which doesn't make sense, which is about time that we need to do this, and addressing basically this. Can we show the slide? Sorry, yeah. Addressing basically this, because if we don't deal with the problem that it's costly to do business in Europe, we're not going to go anywhere. And I think finally, in terms of direction, we have this finally idea that only with legislation you're not going to be the number one. And the whole Brussels effect that we're going to influence the world, this happens from a position of strength. It can only happen if we're economically prosperous, if we're strong, also if we can defend ourselves in the military way. So yeah, there's lots of pessimism on my side, but I think because of this accumulation of these problems, now you're going to be hearing a lot more about competitiveness, about prosperity, about security, and not so much about, you know, world peace and climate. So this gives me hope. And also, final, to answer your question, Germany needs to change. Maybe it comes from politics, maybe it comes from people, it's complicated, and I don't want to go into this debate. But what I've learned in Brussels in the last couple of years is that the country of Germany, even though it's the economic power horse, and even though it's the biggest economic actor, it has caused lots of problems for this EU. First of all, because they dealt with bilateral politics with the Russians in the beginning. Then they became obsessed about their economic transition to a more sustainable economy. And because of the German economic model, we started sending lots and lots of money to Russia and to China for different things. So I really hope that next year we see a different government in Germany, and I really want to see a Germany which cares about economic prosperity and peace, not only about accommodating the Russians and doing business with really nasty governments. So competitiveness, Germany, these are one of the key pillars, and political leadership. We need a new type of philosophy in political leadership. Again, with the hope that after these elections this year, there's a new kind of energy. Second question was of the views of the parties. It's a great question. And you asked specifically, David, about the EPP. The big problem the EPP sees, also the big problem liberal parties out there, they also see with the AI Act, is the crazy amount of rules and regulations. And the fact that if you're a European small business, you cannot do business with these rules because they're so complex, so costly. You need to have huge staff, you need to have legal support, technical support. So the message coming from liberal parties and more conservative center-right parties will be, let's try to keep those rules so that nasty things don't really happen. Let's have this standard. But also let's be realistic and pragmatic that we need to cut some of this bureaucracy because this is not sustainable. So this is the message coming from the liberal and conservative parties. From the more socialist parties, when it comes to artificial intelligence, their philosophy is that they're very afraid about human welfare and about jobs. And socialists are worried that if we have this AI revolution, this will cost employment opportunities. And let's be honest, there is this risk. So this is the main concern of the socialists. And the biggest concern of the Greens with the AI Act was about the emissions of the AI technologies. This was one of the biggest talking points. You sit with them and you talk about prosperity, about technology, about foundational models, about ChatGPT, and they listen, and they ask you about the emissions. So, you know, different political philosophies. Final question, which was a great question, is technology running faster than regulation? Absolutely. I'll give another example. Sorry, can you show the slide again? Yeah. When they did the draft for the AI Act, I think 4 years ago, when they started working on this, there was no ChatGPT. So under the rules from before, chatbots are limited risk, meaning very little requirements and obligations. But then ChatGPT came, and everybody was like, wow, this is real. And many people in Brussels were like, oh shit, ChatGPT is limited risk, even though we know that it can bring to other risks, you know? So they had to rethink and put additional requirements and la 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 la. So long story short, technology is running way faster than regulation. So you cannot expect to regulate the technology of the future the way we regulated our transport sectors or basic economic sectors, right? And this is the huge challenge. You need to do regulation and rules which give the basic guidelines, but not go so deep and specific so you kill all innovation. And I think that's what the EU tried to do, to be very specific, very prescriptive, while technology runs in its own pace.
Grazie Dimitar, credo che la tua risposta sia molto chiara e devo dire anche condivisibile, nel senso che la regolamentazione per sua natura non può che seguire l'innovazione, il contenuto dell'attività umana è l'innovazione, la regolamentazione serve per aiutare a indirizzarla, come ha suggerito anche l'intervento del Papa che abbiamo visto stamattina. E ci sono ancora degli interventi, possiamo fare un secondo giro. Maria Francesca.
Grazie mille. Anch'io volevo chiedere una cosa sulla regolamentazione, perché adesso ci dicevi come sono cambiati un po' gli obiettivi dell'Unione Europea, sono un po' cambiate le parole d'ordine, parlavi prima di clima, adesso di competitività. Io ho solo il timore che restino un po' sempre delle appunto parole d'ordine che non tengono tanto conto né degli impatti reali né, come emergeva un po' questa mattina, di una conoscenza, perché adesso l'esempio che facevi su ChatGPT, cioè immagino che magari un supporto anche tecnico potesse aiutare a immaginare i rischi 4 anni fa di quello che è avvenuto poi 2 anni dopo. E l'altra cosa che volevo chiedere è se si tiene in conto del fatto del rischio di raddoppio di burocrazia nel passaggio tra diciamo Bruxelles e gli Stati membri, perché quello che abbiamo visto, vabbè, l'esempio che facevi tu dell'Irlanda, ma anche quello che vediamo qui in Italia, non so, penso al GDPR o adesso alla CSRD sulla sostenibilità, quello che abbiamo visto un po' accadere, un po' rischiare di accadere nel nostro paese è che si facessero perseguire l'Europa delle legislazioni ancora più dure di quello che l'Europa stessa chiedeva, a discapito delle appunto piccole e medie imprese soprattutto, ma anche delle grandi in Italia. E quindi volevo capire se mi chiedo se la soluzione sia, come si diceva stamattina, della decisione politica che tiene conto delle alternative di tutti questi fattori e non semplicemente, come dire, di parole che si inseguono e che poi restano lontane dalla realtà, come infatti l'Europa viene sempre sentita tanto lontana.
Sì, mi inserisco su questa per porre una domanda io, poi restituisco la parola al pubblico, ma mi domando, quello che rispondevi anche prima, cioè rispetto alle interferenze delle big tech e ai problemi che i vincoli legislativi per forza di cose creano anzitutto a chi non ha la struttura per rispettare per comply, no? Con tutto quello che c'è da fare, non giustificherebbero, ed eventualmente si è già pensato, una legislazione evidentemente a due velocità, cioè la legge deve essere generale e astratta e deve valere per tutti, ma evidentemente ci sono dei principi che devono valere per chi ha certi capitali, per chi svolge attività su una certa scala, e ci devono essere delle regole diverse per chi fa altro e per chi ha una struttura che non può permettersi di conformarsi a tutti i requisiti che vengono chiesti e che effettivamente non dà luogo neanche agli stessi rischi a cui danno luogo quelli che gestiscono dati su larga scala. Raccogliamo ancora una domanda? One more question? Augusto.
Grazie mille per la presentazione, anzitutto. Non ho visto il film Dune, però colgo l'analogia che hai fatto con il selvaggio, prima di andarmene, come suggerito, colgo l'analogia che hai fatto con il selvaggio West e la risposta che hai dato in merito al fatto che la legislazione inseguirà sempre una tecnologia che corre troppo più a una velocità troppo superiore, per chiedere: ma l'Europa sotto questo profilo, oltre a sviluppare strategie diverse a livello legislativo, non può fare un serio investimento in ambito educativo? Adesso non dico di creare una materia che si chiami tecnologia staccata da tutto il resto, ma per esempio la lezione del collega, il professor Mercorio, non potrebbe essere fatta a diversi livelli di istruzione scolastica per preparare i docenti e quindi, insomma, educare questi giovani che si trovano in mano delle pistole e tante volte appunto le usano in modo un po' selvaggio, no? Non avendo un'educazione in merito. Cioè educare prima di dover poi dopo punire e raccogliere i pezzi a posteriori.
Shall we make a turn about pencils?
Yeah, let's. Thank you very much.
Al prossimo giro.
Okay.
Next turn.
Yeah, let's focus on this now. I'll start from the final question, and I'll start with education, because this is very interesting. Can we make this structural push on education on the European level? Now, I have to be very clear. Educational policy is a national competence, and Europe has very limited competence. Brussels has limited competence in education, because the EU is set on a certain fundamental treaties and division of responsibilities. For example, Europe and the European Commission is in charge of trade policy, agricultural policy, regional policy. This is for Brussels, competition as well. But in some areas, education, religion, sport, culture, this is left for the national level. So what the EU can do is guidelines, reports, maybe scoring different accomplishments on education or giving some recommendations. Maybe you need to do this or that, but Brussels cannot interfere with educational policies. So this is a sector which every national country in the EU has exclusive competence. And this is logical because of division, because different cultures, different languages, different philosophies, and I respect that. And I think that we should have this idea that even though we are a collective union, different countries have different cultural and national specific ideas about education and culture. Just a clarification. So your question about this big push in education is in a way problematic because Brussels cannot navigate educational policy. What we can do, and this is again another potential priority, is put more European money in research and next generation kind of innovation. This is something which the EU can do. But when it comes to the national policy, what's going to be in the textbooks or what subjects are Italian kids and Bulgarian kids going to learn, this is for the national level. And these issues are very delicate, by the way, because when people speak in Brussels about education, some people freak out. in Bulgaria, for example, I'm Bulgarian, when people in Brussels start talking about, you know, being a bit more open and tolerant in educational programs, thinking about minorities, people thinking about different sexual orientations, you know, kind of positive ideas, the pro-Russian parties and the populist parties in Bulgaria start saying they want to make our kids gay. or they want to brainwash our kids, you know. So that's why in Brussels it's very delicate to talk about education, because you get a very sometimes negative response. So I think that we should be focused about investing money in research so that this can bring to breakthroughs in education. Your question. The EU, I think, learned the lesson a bit. I gave the example with the GDPR, I gave the example with the AI Act about the small and medium enterprises. And with the new legislation which enters now, this year and next year, there's specific clarification that the rules and the really tough rules are going to apply for only the really big companies. This is happening. And there's different qualifications and different criteria. For example, if you have more than 40 million users and a turnover of more than, I think it was 10 billion euros every year, you are qualified as a very large online platform. And if you're a very large online platform, you get a lot of requirements. These are mostly all the big tech companies, Spotify in Europe, Booking also in Europe, SAP, the big German company as well, and Alibaba and Alipay, the Chinese, fall within this big criteria. And for the other companies, the smaller the company, the less the requirements. So the thing you said is very important, and I think Brussels is learning the lesson, because with GDPR in 2016, with data protection, the rules for Facebook and the rules for like an NGO or a small enterprise were almost the same. And an NGO or a small company doesn't have Facebook or Google's legal team or the money, right? So I think what you said about compliance and about changing the rules so that you don't discriminate against small businesses, this is happening, but much can be improved. And I hope we do see this push towards simplification. And the first question on the bureaucracies and the buzzwords, you are absolutely right. I don't know, we've entered this very strange time of politics. Maybe it's because of social media. Maybe because of people don't have the attention to read about complex problems. Everything is communicated in very simple messaging, you know. Green Deal, okay. We all want to save the climate, but when you go and you say, let's be a bit more pragmatic, they tell you, you're a climate denier. You don't believe in climate change. And I'm trying to say, no, I believe in climate change. I know that humanity has this problem, but maybe the rules we have right now are not the best rules. So we've entered this like very strange time where everything is buzzwords, everything is these concepts, especially when we want to talk to a more global audience. And that's why the EU sometimes operates in buzzwords, because it's 27 different nations, and having a very specific dialogue on everything in detail is a bit impossible. So that's why maybe we gravitate to the buzzwords. About the bureaucracies, you are absolutely right. And I gave the example how Ireland, the Irish bureaucracy was not following the European rules. And this is a problem because European bureaucracy in its foundation in the 50s, 60s, 70s was a very small, very flexible bureaucracy. But now we've had a generation of different, you know, directorates, different institutions, which brings its own kind of more money, more people, and this whole thing grows and becomes slow. Even though compared to a national administration, the EU bureaucracy, I think it's around 30,000 people, the whole commission is 30,000 people, which is comparable to the municipality of Paris, comparable. but it has become very slow. And this is a very difficult political question. How do we reform the European bureaucracy? Because there's legal protection, there's political protection. So the question you're asking is a sensitive one. How we can make sure that the European bureaucracy works better with the national bureaucracies as well, because sometimes there's clashes. And sometimes the priorities coming from Europe meet the political realities or the political lobbies in certain countries, and this again brings problems. So you're absolutely right about the diagnosis. About the solution, it's difficult, because it's very difficult to change the bureaucracy.
Bene, abbiamo tempo per un ultimo giro di domande. Ce n'era una qua, prego Gian.
Mi aspettavo che tu menzionassi tra i sistemi a rischio inaccettabile per l'AI-Act i sistemi d'arma. Ci sono delle prospettive per l'equivalente della Convenzione di Ginevra per impedire... Okay, I expected you to mention the arms in the system with unacceptable risks. Okay, are there any chances of an update of the Geneva Convention in order to prohibit the AI triggering shooting? Okay, take the decision of shooting. First question. The second one is in one of your slides, you mentioned the relationship between Europe and USA. I wonder, on a completely abstract, historical, long-term view, are we not better served in looking for strengthening our links, eventually upsetting into the EU Russia at cost of setting ourselves a bit apart from USA?
C'è ancora qualche domanda? Attenzione alle cuffie che fischiano col microfono. Sorry. The shuffles make noise. Prego.
Io avevo solo un dubbio. Volevo capire se il fatto che l'Unione Europea non investisse in sviluppare una propria intelligenza artificiale fosse solo un fattore economico o se invece ci fossero altre cose, altri problemi.
Se non c'è altro, facciamo...
Clarify the question, sorry, can you...
Cioè se il fatto che l'Unione Europea non sviluppi una propria intelligenza artificiale al posto di andare a regolamentare quelle che arrivano da altri paesi fosse solo una questione economica legata al fatto che l'energia costa troppo, eccetera, o se ci fossero altri fattori.
Cristina, in fondo.
Buonasera, grazie per l'intervento. Una curiosità, la situazione mondiale anche con la presenza di questi conflitti, in particolare mi è venuto in mente quello tra Russia e Ucraina durante il suo intervento, ha un nesso anche rispetto a questa esigenza di energia sempre più pressante? Volevo capire un po' questo. Grazie.
Se qualcuno ha ancora qualche domanda, la faccia ora. Taccia per sempre.
All of these have been really good questions. In Brussels, people ask me about irrelevant things. Here, people ask about really important things. The Geneva Convention, good question. The EU tried to push this and to make this happen. In the G7 meeting in Hiroshima, in Japan, when was it? Earlier this year or last year, there was this Hiroshima Declaration on AI, and I think it's kind of ironic in a way, Hiroshima Declaration, but it's important to remember history. The idea was that the global community, or at least the big economies, will work about exactly this, what you're saying, that there should not be AI when it comes to nuclear weapons, when it comes to warfare. But this is the opinion of the EU, maybe also of the US, but the Chinese, the Russians, even the Indians, even the Israelis do not really agree. Because they know that if we agree on this, if we put this limitation, this means that you need to also put limitations on research. And you need to put limitations on studying advanced AI. And countries know that if they don't do it, somebody else is going to do it, even if it's for really bad purposes. So my big fear is that it's very difficult on the global level to agree on this. During the Cold War, it took 20 years before the Soviet Union and America did this agreement on limiting nuclear warheads. SALT and the other dialogues. So the big question is, can we replicate this agreement? Humanity and the big global players decided that we need to cooperate on the basic level on nuclear Armageddon. Can we also cooperate on the AI Armageddon? And for now, this topic is being pushed only by the EU. And many of the other international actors are still not convinced. They want to put their signature because they also want to study this and maybe profit from it. So I share the concern, but especially Russia, China, and India are not that willing to cooperate on such high level for now. About the question about the relationship with Russia, maybe my presentation was a bit, pessimistic, but on the relationship with America, the US is our main trade partner, our main defense guarantor. I am clearly up for a pro-American relationship, but I want to have a more pragmatic and sober relationship, especially on technology, because on technology, private American companies are doing whatever they want. Even though America is our irreplaceable trade and defense partner, right now America is stabilizing our energy usage with LNG. So with the question with Russia, I respectfully disagree. I do not see what the Russians can offer to Europeans right now. Maybe only cheap gas. But when I'm looking at the Russian society, the Russian economy, Russian industry, I don't see how their economic model or their industrial model can be attractive for us, or I don't see anything in that direction. AI, why not developing in Europe? We don't have enough venture capital, number one. Energy is very expensive. Regulation is very tough. Labor force and salaries and taxation is very, very high. Our economic model is not really prepared for the AI revolution. Let's put it at that. I'm not saying automatically this is a bad thing. We are a social market economy which cares about people, welfare, people's, not only productivity, but also welfare. And in America, it's a different mindset. You don't have universal health care. You have 0 holidays guaranteed on the federal level. It's a free-for-all. It's a different economic mindset. And when it comes to AI and next generation technologies, this kind of economy provides better. That's the reality. In Europe, we lead better lives. We're not that rich, but we lead better lives. We have more security, more welfare. So on your question, why are we not developing AI models on our own? Well, as I said, it's very complex. The data regulation, expensive salaries, expensive taxes, expensive energy, and also our companies are not the same and they don't have the same access to funding. Ukraine and energy, absolutely. There's a link, simply because Gazprom stopped supplying European countries with gas. This is number one. And number two is this year, in the end of December this year, there's a contractual agreement between Ukraine and Russia for the transit of natural gas in the pipelines going to Europe. And during the war, part of the gas continued going through Ukraine, even though they're in a war. But this year, when this agreement expires, and both Russia and Ukraine have said we don't want to continue this agreement, this means that all of the gas coming from pipeline from Russia will be stopped. And the question is where we're going to get the gas from. Most of it comes right now from America with LNG, from Norway. But we need to find alternatives to Russian gas internationally, either through pipelines. I think Italy has a good geography and you have a very positive reality of having pipelines with Algeria, and this stabilizes your energy mix. But for the rest of the EU, this is a structural problem because we based our economy around cheap Russian gas, and now Gazprom doesn't want to send the gas. The Germans are also looking for energy, and we need in the next couple of years, we need to find international shipments, or something which I'm saying, this is my own personal opinion, we should be thinking a bit more about exploiting natural gas deposits in our own Mediterranean, in the Black Sea, in the Northern Sea, because we still have natural gas deposits, but because of the Green Deal and because of the stigma on climate, we decided not to exploit them. And I think it needs to be a combination of Europe waking up on its own energy resources and making sure we have diversified shipments from other countries. Because this is, otherwise we'll be in this never-ending challenge for the next years with the energy price. Thank you. I think we're going over time.
Many thanks Dimitar, grazie, grazie davvero. Credo che la tua partecipazione oggi ci abbia aiutato a capire più a fondo quello che dice, mi permetto qui una digressione giuridica, l'articolo 3 del Trattato sull'Unione Europea, quando dice che l'Unione Europea nelle relazioni con... Scusate, ma non so che cos'è che rimbombi, forse questo. Nelle relazioni con il resto del mondo afferma e promuove i suoi valori e interessi, contribuendo alla protezione dei suoi cittadini, contribuisce alla pace, alla sicurezza, allo sviluppo sostenibile della terra, alla solidarietà e al rispetto reciproco tra i popoli. Io credo che l'approfondimento che abbiamo fatto oggi, illuminato anche dalle parole del Papa, come sono state sottolineate stamattina, ci aiuti a capire che l'Europa ha effettivamente una grossa responsabilità nel mondo, ha effettivamente molto lavoro da fare e che però purtroppo non si può fare solo con le parole, non si può fare solo con le regole. Bisogna armarsi di intelligenza e di tante risorse, e direi che oggi su questo abbiamo avuto una panoramica davvero approfondita. Grazie ancora Dimitar e vi invito al coffee break. Grazie.